It's a pleasure to be here. I think we have a very important and timely topic for discussion. That is NAFTA and the new trade agenda. As we speak, the NAFTA negotiators are meeting in Mexico City for the fifth round. And to say that these talks have been challenging, I think would be an understatement. The original proposal was to conclude these negotiations by the end of the year. That's not going to happen. And a new twist here is that these negotiations are taking place under the shadow of a potential US withdrawal from the agreement. So I think that what really is creating so much tension in the negotiations, in my humble opinion, is that you have two different rationales coming from the US side as to what should be the objectives, the drivers of the NAFTA redo. On the one hand, there is the modernization objectives, because it is already a 23-year-old agreement and the world economy has changed in dramatic ways, and therefore to bring up-to-date rules and standards. But then there is the other objective, and that is the attempt to try to reduce bilateral trade deficits through trade agreements. And it could very well be that we end up sacrificing one objective for the sake of the other. So there's a lot riding in these negotiations. We have tremendous expertise here in the panel. So I'm going to turn it over to our panelists and ask them to give us some brief opening remarks where they can perhaps lay out for us what are the stakes in these negotiations, what do they think should be the driving objectives, and what are the obstacles to get there. So I'm going to proceed in the order in which they're sitting. So John, if you could please go first.
Well, thank you, Mireya. It's a pleasure to be here today, and it's been a pleasure over the years to meet with a number of your organizations across the country. The topic at hand, NAFTA, it's very appropriate that if we're going to talk about trade policy in the Trump administration, NAFTA provides the window into what's going on. It's the one big negotiation that's underway, and what's going on there is being followed very closely, not just by people here in the United States, but around the world. I get calls every day from foreign embassies calling me up and saying, I'm the embassy of Sweden. What's going on in NAFTA? And that's because this is where we're getting insight into what this administration would like to do on trade. Now, over the years, NAFTA has had its detractors, its defenders, but there's a line from a song that I like to quote. Don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you got till it's gone? The past year with the threat of losing NAFTA or seeing NAFTA tossed overboard has really brought new attention to the agreement and to its benefits. Today, the United States has $1.3 trillion of trade every year with Canada and Mexico. That's $3.3 billion a day. There are 14 million American jobs that depend on trade with Canada and Mexico. In many ways, NAFTA has been a huge success. For American manufacturers, Canada and Mexico buy so much made in the USA manufactured goods that it's more than what we sell to the next 10 countries on the list combined. For American farmers and ranchers, these are our top two markets in the world. U.S. farm exports have quadrupled under NAFTA. And for service providers, we have a huge trade surplus with these countries. So it's really been interesting to hear more and more voices speaking out in support of the NAFTA. Now, the agreement's 22 years old. It makes a world of sense to think about how we can modernize it. I mean, think back to the early 90s. The internet, it existed, but I don't think any of us were on it. People weren't buying and selling things on it. So adding provisions to facilitate e-commerce and digital trade makes a lot of sense. And there's a number of areas where we know how to have better rules to ensure that sanitary and phytosanitary standards aren't actually a trade barrier. There's a lot of things we can do to modernize the agreement. But there's growing concern that that's not really how it's going. In the past 6 weeks or so, as the negotiations have really taken hold, advanced, we've seen the U.S. administration roll out a number of proposals that are causing quite a lot of concern in the U.S. business and agriculture community. My boss, Tom Donahue, the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, has called them poison pills. I'll just mention a few of them. One is a sunset clause that would cause the agreement to automatically terminate after 5 years, unless the three parties all agree to keep it. That's a problem because investors, they like to have the certainty and security that knowing that the terms of trade and the conditions under which you're doing business are going to stay stable in order to make investment in bricks and mortar, to hire people. So having a clause like that, it actually undermines the purpose of the agreement. Another provision relates to the auto sector, which is the largest traded sector in North America. It's our largest manufacturing sector in the United States. These provisions would
No? Okay. Okay.
So these provisions, what's been proposed is that the content requirement, what has to be made in North America, would go up substantially. But under the NAFTA, it's already the highest of any free trade agreement in the world. And industry has said that the proposal this administration is making is not workable. That actually it would add costs on making cars here in the United States. It would actually incentivize the movement of production offshore. There's some other proposals which I'm sure we'll get into as we go along. Troubling outlook. Fifth round, which just started yesterday. A number of us are traveling to Mexico City over the weekend to be there for this. I think one of the concerns is that these proposals are setting the stage for a withdrawal from it. And that's profoundly worrying. Whatever you thought about NAFTA back in 1993, it's been the law of the land for a quarter century. We have supply chains that go back and forth across all those 14 million American jobs I mentioned are going back to the old trade barriers, the higher tariffs that existed before NAFTA. They would cut the supply chains into ribbons. And it really could be extremely disruptive for the U.S. economy. So increasingly, you're hearing the business and agriculture community ring an alarm bell about this. So I'll stop there and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, John. So Lorraine, if you want to go next.
Okay. We can't hear. They can't hear us. Can you hear you?
Can you hear us now? Great. It's like the Sprint commercial. Okay, Mireya, thank you very much for the introduction. And Leslie, thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a real honor. This is actually my first World Affairs conference. So I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to represent ADM as well as the agriculture sector here today. For those of you that don't know, ADM is a global agribusiness company that operates in 160 countries around the world. And as our company moves food, feed, and energy products from areas of production to those of consumption, we benefit from trade agreements that provide duty-free access and ensure efficient movement of products across borders. For ADM and for our industry, the North America Free Trade Agreement, NAFTA, represents one of the single most important free trade agreements there is. 22 years ago, some odd months, NAFTA knit together the agricultural markets of the US, Canada, and Mexico and enabled all three of our countries and our citizens to benefit from a complementary suite of food and agriculture output at largely zeroed tariffs. And for our company, this meant that NAFTA deepened what was already a very important trade relationship with Canada and Mexico. ADM has gone to invest $1 billion in Mexico. We actually import 1/3 of all agriculture imports coming into Mexico, and Mexico is dependent upon U.S. corn for 95% of their corn supply. So those are big numbers. In Canada, we've also invested similar dollars, and we have 42 manufacturing facilities across Canada. And what that does for us is create an interlocking chain of food and agriculture trade so that across our borders, consumers in Mexico, the US, and Canada are able to access reliable, safe, and affordable supplies of food, feed, energy year-round. I'd like to talk a little bit about the industry and the benefits that we see from the NAFTA and have seen over the last 23 years. Since NAFTA was implemented, U.S. food and agriculture exports to Canada and Mexico quadrupled. John mentioned that earlier. And they grew from $11 billion in 1993 to $43 billion just last year in 2016. That's a significant increase, and what that means to us is jobs here in America's heartland. Because of that NAFTA trade boon, our industry grew to support 21 million full and part-time on-farm jobs. And we also, in addition to those outcomes, saw enormous growth in food and agriculture manufacturing. Today, our industry supports, or employs rather, over 2 million people in food and agriculture manufacturing. And in fact, that is the single largest source of employment in all U.S. manufacturing. So it's a very significant piece of our economy, not just for the food and agriculture sector, but for the U.S. economy entirely. So what we've seen is that there's been a lot of concern about U.S. manufacturing jobs leaving America. And what we've experienced in the food and agriculture sector is that these jobs have actually been created, they've flourished, and they've expanded here at home because of NAFTA. And for us, the jobs and centers of food and agriculture output have created, better incomes for U.S. farmers, ranchers, and manufacturers. And the integrated network for food and ag trade that they've provided are really critical for our consumers here in the U.S. and consumers, in all three countries. We recognize, of course, that NAFTA is now, 23 years old. Things have changed dramatically over the last couple decades. There have been new technologies, our economies have changed, the way we do business has changed. And so we recognize that there is a warranted need for a look back at NAFTA and a modernization. For the food and agriculture sector, our first ask, however, was do no harm. Do no harm to the provisions that have served our industry so well and allowed us to achieve such great economic growth, the growth that I just talked about, jobs and manufacturing centers, export opportunities. But we do see, again, that there are opportunities now to introduce 21st century trade provisions into the NAFTA. And so some of the things that we're looking at are more modern sanitary, phytosanitary measures, SPS measures that John mentioned. And some of the things that we look at there would be things like a rapid response mechanism so that we can better address border delays and ensure that disputes around perishable agricultural shipments are resolved expeditiously and at less cost to importers, exporters, and consumers. We also observe, and ADM is one of the largest ethanol producers in the world, that there are opportunities with the modernization of the NAFTA energy chapter. We look at our energy economies in all three countries, and they've changed dramatically over the last couple of decades. And so now we see a real opportunity to modernize NAFTA and to use this moment to achieve regulatory convergence for renewable fuels, particularly for E10 blended gasoline. Particularly now that Mexico has gone through a very ambitious energy reform process, there is a particular opportunity to regularize or to harmonize our gasoline standards on both sides of the border and to enhance energy independence for both of our countries. We also see that modernization provides an opportunity, of course, to incorporate the suite of technological advances that we've seen over the last 20 years. So including provisions for e-commerce and electronic certification and allowing technology to drive more advanced customs procedures can make trade across our borders more efficient and less costly. So I think I'll leave it at there for the introduction, but we are supportive of a NAFTA modernization. We ask that there is no harm done to our sector, that we only continue to improve this agreement, and we remain optimistic that we will conclude the NAFTA negotiations successfully in 2018.
Thank you so much. Very, very interesting presentation, and now we move to agenda.
Thank you. Cisco is, I know. I'm waiting for him. Hello.
There's a problem with the mic, so we will adapt. Good. My name is Jennifer Sanford. I am Director of International Trade Policy for Cisco. Cisco is a world leader in networking for the internet. So we invented the first multi-protocol router, which essentially takes computer systems that speak different languages and knits them together. It's the advent of the internet. So NAFTA, as you suggested, was in its infancy. The internet, as we know it today, was in its infancy when NAFTA was being negotiated. We have some provisions in NAFTA that I think help to promote digital trade, what we know today now as digital trade, things like the telecommunications chapter to liberalize access to one another's telecommunications networks. But I think this new modernization opportunity means that we can do even more and go even farther. So we're looking at what is now called the digital trade chapter. In previous agreements, it's called the e-commerce chapter. And we're looking at things like cross-border data flows, because there's so much now that's done over the internet and there's so much data. We want to make sure that data can seamlessly move across borders. And I'll give you an example. For Cisco, we have a very large technical services center that's in Research Triangle Park, North Carolina. And there is a dedicated fiber line between our RTP facility and a technical assistance center that we have in Mexico City. So the collaboration between our two countries, not just in the goods area, but in the services area, is quite intense and is intensifying every day. So the cross-border data is very important. Not being required by governments to host data in particular countries. So getting governments out of the way and allowing companies to design their networks in a way that makes the best sense for them. And cybersecurity has become a real hot button issue in the United States and among our trading partners. And for the first time, we have an opportunity to bring in provisions related to cooperation in the cybersecurity area in risk-based management of cyber threats. So in digital trade, I think we're excited. We think that there's a lot that can be done. In the technical barriers to trade section of the agreement, we think there's some improvements that can be done there, and products with encryption, and getting Mexico to adopt a mutual recognition agreement in telecom, as well as getting Mexico into the information technology agreement. So this is really a great chance to modernize the agreement. And yet at the same time, in the spirit of do no harm, we are seeing some proposals from the administration that would undermine the agreement overall. And so I know we're going to get into those areas in Q&A, so I'll hold off.
Thank you very much. So obviously a lot on the table. First, I'm going to ask the panelists a few questions, but then I promise I'm going to bring it to you. And actually, I have Leslie helping me with time keeping, because it turns out today is the day I forget to wear my wristwatch. So anyway, Leslie, I'm keeping an eye on you. Thank you. So as you've all heard, this negotiation has very new elements. We are seeing proposals that we had not seen a previous U.S. administration table in any trade agreement. One of them has to do with rules of origin for automobiles. And for the first time, the U.S. Proposal that there be a specific U.S. content to every vehicle that is produced in the United States, 50%. Now, if you think about NAFTA, NAFTA stands for a North American Integrated Production Platform. So in principle, it shouldn't matter where any of these components or where everything is assembled. It should just happen within the region, complying with those rules of origin. And clearly, Canada and Mexico are not very eager to accept any of these proposals. So it's a more general question. First of all, how would this impact the competitiveness of the North American automobile industry? But more generally, what is the philosophy behind this? Is it really realistic to think that you can renationalize supply chains? What will be the consequences? Would NAFTA cease to be de facto a duty-free area because companies decide just not to follow the rule of origin? What will be the implications if this actually gets tabled and accepted? Not very likely, but what would happen if?
Well, it's a good question, and it's a big deal because this is our largest manufacturing sector in the United States and across North America. And it's one that's done really well out of NAFTA. You know, last year, the U.S. auto industry produced 1 million more cars than they did the year before NAFTA. And they're increasingly competitive globally, exporting to other world regions. In the past decade, U.S. auto sales to China have risen 6-fold, for instance. We're selling a lot of cars to the Middle East now. And that's because we're a pretty low-cost place to make cars. And we do it because, well, we do it as Team North America. So there are some parts in a car, like a wire harness, that are very labor intensive. It's not very high skilled work necessarily. This is basically taking a bunch of wires and interweaving them, and it's laborious. And this is something that's not been made in the United States for years now. Mexico makes a lot of wire harnesses. That's an example of one part that's made there. A lot of engines, though, are made in the United States. Think of Cummins. Cummins and plants in Indiana and many other states. Every time they put an engine into a truck or a car, sometimes in a facility in Mexico, the engines are all made here. High value stuff, a lot of R&D go into it. So this system has worked pretty well. By having this exaggerated high requirement for North American content, taking it from where it is now, which is the highest of any free trade agreement in the world, 62.5%, up to 85%, as the administration is proposing, it's first of all not really achievable. What would happen is that the industry would say, you know what, we're just not going to accomplish that, and therefore I'm not going to trade under NAFTA rules. Instead, I'm just going to pay the U.S. most favored nation WTO tariff. This is the tariff that we levy on goods coming in from anywhere else in the world where we don't have a free trade agreement with. It's 2.5% for cars. And, you know, that's a cost, and some of it will be passed on to the consumer if that's what happened. But then they wouldn't have to bother about tracking all the content and where all the pieces come. So companies then would be liberated to source from wherever they like. You'd probably wind up with less North American content. You'd get more inputs coming from Asia and Europe and elsewhere. So this is a kind of proposal that I think has not been, the implications have not been understood fully. And that's why you see such a united front by industry. Ford, Hyundai, Volkswagen, all of these companies, US manufacturers, foreign nameplates, all working together to try and quickly educate the administration. Yesterday, there was a letter signed by 76 House members saying, you know, stop, this is a bad proposal.
Thank you very much. Very interesting. Another main area of contention is on dispute settlement. And there's been a set of ideas floated by the US administration that would weaken dispute settlement in different chapters of the NAFTA agreement. One is Chapter 19 that has to do with anti-dumping panels, review panels, which Canada obviously cares a lot about. But there's also the question about what happens with investment arbitration, ISDS, for the trade nerds in the room. And the US seems to be proposing some kind of opt-in system. But we know that ISDS, investment arbitration, is hotly debated in any trade negotiation, generates a lot of pushback from different groups in society, and sometimes complicates the chances of ratification. Nevertheless, the Chamber and other business groups here in the United States have said that they consider ISDS to be a crucial, integral part of a successful NAFTA renegotiation. The USTR Lighthizer has said that American multinational corporations could go to the market for insurance, that they do not need ISDS. So if you have some comments as to how do you see ISDS and why it must be part of NAFTA, even though you know that that raises the temperature in any ratification vote.
Right. So this is an administration that is concerned that trade agreements and other kinds of international agreements are an infringement on American sovereignty. During the campaign, Jeff Sessions made a comment about the United States. He said, we're like Gulliver in the land of the Lilliputians. Remember, he woke up and he was tied down by all these little threads. This is the vision that they have of what international agreements sometimes do. I think we in the business community don't see it that way. In these agreements, you agree to certain commitments. You're bound by dispute settlement. But typically, we gain so much more than we're giving up. And time and again, we're able to get better access to foreign markets because of these agreements as a result. So that's true on, you mentioned Chapter 19. This is a provision that allows binational panels to be established to review anti-dumping and countervailing duty tariffs. These are tariffs put in place by domestic trade law when there's a sense that the other country is not trading fairly. And Canada, this was their most important demand at the end of the US-Canada Free Trade Agreement negotiations. The agreement almost collapsed over it. So they're very committed to keeping it. Similarly, Investor State Dispute Settlement, or ISDS, which is a different chapter in NAFTA, what it does is that it enforces investment commitments in the agreement. These are commitments that the three governments are going to treat investment from the other countries, what's called national treatment. They're going to treat them just as well as they do domestic companies. They're not going to discriminate against them for being foreign. And if there's an expropriation for some reason, they're going to be compensated. In other words, these are rules that echo our Constitution. You think of the Takings Clause, which says you have to compensate in the event of expropriation. So that's what these panels enforce. But unfortunately, it's become a highly charged issue, and it's since World War II, basically, the U.S. has been upholding these kinds of provisions in treaties and agreements, and this is an administration that has a different view.
I just wanted to add to that. My understanding on the ISDS point is that that American companies are the ones that actually benefit from these provisions, in the sense that we may not get the rule of law in foreign markets like we get here in the United States. And so these kinds of extraordinary panels are important to have that rule of law in place.
And I would just dovetail off of that, these really are intended to level the playing field, the legal playing field, and to ensure that U.S. companies, operating around the world have the same benefits legally that our competitors have. And just a note on ISDS Chapter 11, the U.S. has actually never lost a case under Chapter 11. And in fact, our industry benefited years ago when we had a dispute regarding trade in Mexico. And so we were able to benefit from Chapter 11, and it served our industry well.
Thank you very much. So let me move the conversation. We know the negotiations have been very challenging. We have been discussing some of these new proposals. And as I started this panel, I opened saying that there has been signaling that the president is considering perhaps withdrawing the United States from NAFTA if the negotiations do not work out well. So two questions here wrapped into one. Can Congress rescue NAFTA? And if not, how does business adapt to a NAFTA without the United States?
So Article 1 of the Constitution gives authority to regulate foreign trade to the Congress, not to the president. So can Congress intervene here? Yes. Are they going to intervene right now? No. Right now, Congress is focused on tax reform and other issues. But when it comes to the NAFTA negotiations, they're definitely keeping one eye on it. I think you're hearing more and more members of Congress who are hearing from their constituents, and they're speaking out and weighing in with the administration. A colleague of mine is down in Austin today, where the Republican Governors Association is meeting. Vice President Pence is there, and I understand that a number of governors have raised this NAFTA issue with the Vice President. So we're hearing more and more people speak out, and I think the Congress does remember that this is that this is an authority that they hold and not the executive branch. If the president did move forward on this path, several chaotic things would happen. There would be immediately, I think, lost export sales. Mexico would opt to import a lot of agricultural commodities from South America instead of the U.S. There would be an immediate sense of pain and lost jobs here in the United States, which would accumulate 6 months later when withdrawal might actually happen. But you would also see litigation. Somebody would bring a lawsuit to stop this, making the point that I was just making, that Congress has to be involved to withdraw from a trade agreement. And where that would all end is difficult for anybody to say.
Just a couple other comments on that in terms of the impact. First of all, it's important to make the point that even the mention of withdrawal has market impacts. So that does have an impact in and of itself. Withdrawal, we estimate, would probably result in a loss, not we as ADM, but we as the industry estimate that it would result in a loss of over 250,000 jobs across the U.S. economy, 50,000 alone farm jobs. For us, as an agricultural exporter, John made the point that, our partners would diversify in terms of looking to other countries to supply their agricultural products. So, for example, last year, the U.S. exported about $3 billion worth of, or $3 million rather, no, sorry, $3 billion worth of corn products to our trading partners in the NAFTA bloc. And if we lost that market, that would result in about 25,000 lost jobs. You had similar trade for soybeans as well. So about $3 billion last year for our NAFTA bloc exports. And so it would have really significant and very harmful impacts on the food and agriculture sector if a withdrawal were to occur.
And I'd say for Cisco, on the good side, in terms of where products are made, because we make products in Mexico, that manufacturing would not necessarily come back to the U.S. It could go to Asia, it could go to other parts of the world. So I don't know that the impact would be exactly what the administration is anticipating.
Thank you. Very interesting. My last question before I bring you all into the conversation. Let's bring it to the theme of the conference, which is American leadership. Clearly we're seeing changes in U.S. foreign policy, but I think that the changes have been most dramatic in the arena of trade. And it's interesting to also note that the first steps of this administration were to withdraw from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Trade Agreement, an agreement that connected 12 countries representing 40% of GDP. And just last weekend, we saw that those 11 remaining countries are still marching on, and they have agreed to a broad agreement that brings them closer to the finish line. The administration then has reopened existing trade agreements, started with NAFTA, and others talk about going and doing changes on the implementation of the Korea-US trade agreement. I call these negotiating with the rear view mirror because they seem to be looking backwards when other countries perhaps are negotiating fresh crops of mega trade agreements. But we know that trade has become more divisive, the trade debate in the United States, that trade votes in Congress are harder to get. So I want to get everybody's thoughts as to where does the United States stand in its ability to articulate leadership, in its ability to deliver on trade liberalization, and what happens if the rest of the world moves without us?
My sense is that U.S. leadership in trade is very much wanting these days under this administration, which is really unfortunate. After 70 years of U.S. leadership in the GATT and the WTO, I think that we're seeing the slow erosion of U.S. leadership. And unfortunately, our trading partners, as you suggest, will turn to each other and not turn to us in order to formulate these preferential trade pacts. And I wouldn't just focus on the regional agreements or the bilateral agreements, but the multilateral agreements in the WTO, where we're also seeing a keen lack of U.S. leadership on the multilateral front. And for companies like ours, these multilateral agreements really do provide a level playing field globally. And we need those agreements to continue. So I think it's dark times for U.S. leadership on trade. We seem to be hunkering down and looking inward.
Well, from where we sit, first of all, we've appreciated the administration's receptivity to the agriculture sector and our interests, not only with NAFTA, but trade around the world. I think for us, we need export markets, whether it be, through continued leadership with a NAFTA trade agreement or elsewhere in the world. This is a time when we are in a state of overcapacity in terms of agricultural output, and farm incomes are at a low level. And so what that means is we really need foreign markets to sell our products. and market openings. And I think, however the leadership plays out on the trade agenda, what we need are export markets.
On trade, when you stand still, you fall behind. And there's a danger that in today's world, we're going to see more of that taking place. If, we had some European officials in, and they said that the European Union's trade commissioner, Cecilia Malmström, says that her phone is ringing off the hook with countries that are calling up saying, hey, we want to negotiate a trade agreement with the European Union. And this is going on around the world. Canada, to our north, has a brand new trade pact with Europe. They're negotiating with Japan. Mexico, to our south, is modernizing its 20-year-old trade agreement with the EU. They've just entered into the TPP 11, where the other countries that were involved in the Trans-Pacific Partnership are moving ahead without the U.S. What this does is it means that companies based in all of those other countries have better access to one another's markets. They can sell their goods made in those countries with their local domestic workers duty-free into the other countries. While we in the U.S., we're the schmucks who are paying the tariffs and trying to sell at a disadvantage with one arm tied behind our back. So it's a concerning situation, and what I hear increasingly from across agriculture and business is we need to get back on offense.
Thank you very much. So now you get to ask the questions. So if you can please raise your hand. I believe that they're going to be, there's a microphone, and I already see the first person standing. So that's wonderful. If you can please identify yourself and ask a very concise question, because I'm pretty sure that we don't have a lot of time left.
Certainly. My name is Bob McGuire, and I'm from the World Affairs Council of Albuquerque. My question is for first and secondly, thank you all for coming this evening and sharing this afternoon and sharing your thoughts with us. My question is to Ms. Hawley. Would you be comfortable putting on the hat of your counterpart in Mexico and addressing the impact of the NAFTA agreement on the agricultural sector of Mexico, and particularly the small family farmers, if you will?
Is this on? Yes. Okay. Well, I can't speak on behalf of my Mexican colleagues, but I can just comment on, the value that we've seen through ADM's investments in Mexico. We've been operating in Mexico for 60 years. And as I mentioned earlier, have invested, over $1 billion in the Mexican agricultural sector and the Mexican agricultural economy. We've also entered into partnerships with SAGARPA, the Mexican Ministry of Agriculture, to help train Mexican farmers and rural community members so that they have an opportunity to produce more, get better incomes, and provide direct access, to ADM as a buyer of their product, eliminating some of the middlemen. So again, they get better income. So I think that, if our trade relationship overall were jeopardized, surely that would have an impact on, Mexican farmers and rural communities. But I can't opine to the extent that, we've done any estimates. But Mexico is very important for us.
Thank you, Lorraine. So we go to the next question, please.
Hi, I'm Ken First from the World Affairs Council of Western Massachusetts. This may be a little off the wall, but I'm wondering if the NAFTA structure right now in any way helps the drug cartels in Mexico, and if in the negotiations there are aspects of them that would be addressing how to thwart them.
Well, one thing does occur to me, and that is that prior to NAFTA, cooperation between the United States and Mexico on anti-narcotics efforts and combating arms trafficking, human trafficking, fighting terror was minimal. And it's really in the past quarter century that our two governments have developed a much closer working relationship on all of those issues. There was a terror threat in the United States when some international terrorist group was going to attempt to assassinate the Saudi ambassador, and U.S. authorities learned about it thanks to intelligence from the Mexican government. This is now an intimate and cooperative relationship where we have shared challenges across our southern border, a level of cooperation that just didn't exist before NAFTA. And I'm happy to say that I think this is widely appreciated in the administration. John Kelly, he was commander of the U.S. Southern Command, and later as Secretary of Homeland Security, he has a lively and personal experience with the value of that kind of cooperation, which frankly would be endangered if we withdrew from the NAFTA.
Yes, thank you. If I can add to that, I think the perspective of the Mexican government is that this is a holistic relationship, and that trade is part of a larger component where there is security cooperation, where there is border cooperation, and if you put in jeopardy the economic cooperation angle, then there might be hurts to the other side of the relationship. If I can go to the next question.
Yes, my name is Ed Martins, and I'm with World Boston. One of President Trump's appeals during the election was, I'm going to tear up NAFTA and I'm going to bring your jobs back. Mm-hmm. And I know enough about business, that's a lot of nonsense, but how can we convince people that NAFTA is in their interest? Because a lot of them, what they saw was, a bunch of guys on Wall Street made a ton of money and their jobs went south. And how can we, for instance, a small manufacturer in Ohio that makes, say, a component to an automobile that's maybe assembled in Mexico, but he sells it to them. And how these things are there's a lot, how we can show that to the small people. It's not the huge companies that make it, the smaller companies that are exporting and that are doing that, how it benefits all of them. We have to convince these people of that because they're convinced it isn't, no matter what the truth is. How can we convince them of that?
It's a good point. And it's a dilemma because, the reality is that U.S. manufacturers have never made so much stuff in the United States. U.S. manufacturing output has almost doubled in the past 25 years. Revenue, exports, profits, it's all up. Now, manufacturers, however, have become much more productive, and they're making all this stuff with fewer workers. That's because of a revolution in automation, information technologies. Our economy is undergoing a rapid change. Now, I think it's a challenge that someone can come in and say, blame it on foreigners, blame it on trade, that a lot of this job loss is coming from that reason. But none of that explanation, though, I think it doesn't actually answer the question. I'm aware of that. And so organizations like ours, the Chamber, through our federation of 2,000 state and local chambers of commerce, we're trying to roll up our sleeves and get out there more. And through events across states in the Midwest and elsewhere where this concern is a little more, I think, deeper, we often find NAFTA is very popular in border states, in the High Plains, in the South, even the Northeast. But in the Midwest, there's at times a greater sense that NAFTA costs jobs. We're trying to roll up our sleeves and do a greater education effort there about what are the real changes going on in our economy, and better yet, what can we do to address it? How can we get better training programs, apprenticeships, very important topics which are actually outside of my expertise.
I'll go to the next question.
Okay, Mary Mendoza, World Boston. Skeptics of NAFTA might say, like Trump, might say NAFTA schmafta. They have to come trade with us because we are their biggest trading partners. Speak to that, please.
They are for now. I would respectfully say to the president that one needs to govern for now and for the future. That we live in a dynamic global economy, and that just because Canada and Mexico are the U.S.'s largest trading partners today does not mean that they will be going forward, particularly if we end a preferential trading relationship with them.
I was just reading today some remarks by President Reagan 29 years ago. That was when the U.S.-Canada Free Trade Agreement just entered into force. And, he recognized that increasing trade around the world and amongst other nations was actually in our interest. It's a triumph of the United States to see that happen. And that is what's going on around the world. Fareed Zakaria calls it the rise of the rest. The fact that poverty is sharply on the decline in developing countries around the world. You see more South-South trade. And that does lead to a reality where in relative terms, even though our exports have been growing, we're seeing that the U.S. market is actually less and less important to other nations. In 1988, I was just doing these numbers, in 1988, the United States was buying about 19% of all the world's imports. Today, it's fallen to about 12%. So for China, for Asia, for Europe, the United States is an important market, but not overwhelmingly so. It's true that for Canada and Mexico, we are very important. But Jen's right. The United States is an important market, but we don't have that kind of dominant role that we had after World War II, simply because the world economy has gotten so much bigger.
Thank you very much. We go to the next question.
Hi, Derek Olson from World Oregon. Hi, John. Can you pivot to talk a little bit about what this NAFTA negotiations might mean for other trade talks like TTIP, the transatlantic, which seems to have fallen off everybody's radar screen, and then with the Trans-Pacific, where they seem to be going forward without us, and if we should read anything larger into it from NAFTA, or is this just a one-off?
The number one we haven't really focused on this here, but when the administration issued its negotiating objectives for NAFTA, the number one thing was to reduce the trade deficit. Now, I'm sure there's a lot of people in the room who were trained in economics and could say why that's not necessarily the best yardstick. What I always like to say about it is, I have a trade deficit with my grocery store. I have a trade deficit with my barber. And it's 2017, so I have a trade deficit with my liquor store. The only people I have a trade surplus with is my employer. And so when it comes to trade, winning or losing, the trade deficit isn't really the best model. So I think that focus, Derek, on the trade deficit has caused a lot of concern among our trading partners, and the things that we're seeing brought to the fore in the NAFTA negotiations. And it's kind of leading other nations to avoid eye contact. The president had a successful trip to Asia. There's a number of major new sales deals that were struck on this, and that's terrific. But we're not entering into new bilateral trade agreements in that region. Japan is one that the president's talked about. Mireya, maybe you can comment on this, but the Japanese, they want the TPP. They don't want a bilateral with the United States, and they don't want a trade agreement that's going to be all about lowering the U.S. trade deficit.
Thank you, John. I would like to jump into this because it really something I follow very closely. All the eyes of the world really are on the NAFTA negotiation. That is the first test of America First trade policy. Nobody understands very clearly what the parameters are going to be. Nobody knows if you can have a successful negotiation with these new provisions that the American government is putting on the table. So everybody's watching, see if this works or not, see if you can carry a negotiation successfully or not. Japan, for example, has long been an observer of NAFTA. Not many people know that Japan used to be a multilateralism-only country until NAFTA provided a wake-up call and they decided we cannot stand still because everybody's negotiating preferentially. And Japan has a lot of interest in the NAFTA region. They have invested in all three countries. Now, Japan very much would like to have the United States back into the TPP. That's why they're negotiating the TPP 11. That's the end game. That's the long game. But they do not want to negotiate bilaterally with the United States because the United States has put the trade balance front and center of the negotiation when we know that the trade balance cannot be attacked or solved with trade instruments. It reflects macroeconomic considerations. So the president was just in Asia. He delivered a big speech for the APEC CEO Summit, and he, in the most evocative part of his speech, talked about an Indo-Pacific dream of a string of bilateral trade agreements. By and large, this is a dream of one. There are no countries that are really lining up to negotiate because they don't see a win-win in the proposals that are put on the table. I'm sorry, last question.
This probably is I won't say the most difficult, but maybe perhaps slightly a little off topic. My name is Mary Beth Bergeron. I'm with the World Affairs Council in Western Massachusetts. Since NAFTA has been implemented over the last 25 years, I have personally seen a reduction in the quality of foodstuff that hits our grocery stores. from outside of our country and inside of our country. The quality just isn't what it used to be. Additionally, there are food illnesses. We've had the largest food recalls in our history, specifically eggs and cheese and peppers and onions, etc., that has ever occurred. And this is because of the international trade that happens, and perhaps the quality standards of importing those foods need to be improved so that we don't have our citizens becoming ill from the foods that are coming in. I do recognize the demand for food. And as the gentleman said, you know, our productivity has certainly increased. But I would say to you and question you, where's the quality?
Thank you very much. Maybe Lorraine, would you like to?
Sure. Well, thank you for your question. That was a very good one, and appreciate your concern. I can't comment on vegetables or meat because we don't do those products, but I will just underscore that, you know, for our industry, we put a premium on safety and quality, and you know, around the world, I think that our U.S. agricultural products are well known for their high standard. You know, there are always things that we can do better in terms of improving food safety and improving the architecture that allows us to have, you know, high food safety standards. And we're very, very committed to efforts to make that happen.
So our time is up. Thank you so much for attending this session. If you can please join me in thanking the panelists for sharing their insights this afternoon.